Wrote a book called The Gospel According to God, and it's from Isaiah 53, that great chapter. And you read Isaiah 53, and it's the biography of the Messiah, the servant of the Lord, and it lays out his arrival and his rejection and his death and his resurrection and his ascension and his coronation. It explains the gospel in more specific terms than any chapter in the New Testament. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace fell on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Wow. That sounds like the Christian doctrine of justification, because that's exactly what it is. And then it says his life was cut off. And then it says he will see his offspring. Well, if his life was cut off, how could he see his offspring? When I die, I'm not going to see my offspring. That's the resurrection. And then you have the coronation. You even have in that chapter a shift, because the chapter begins with the plural we. We saw him and he was like a root out of dry ground. He was like a root sticking up you would trip over. He was like a sucker branch. You whack it off. He was meaningless, useless, and there was no beauty that we would desire him. He didn't fit our messianic picture, and he didn't do what we thought he would do. He didn't knock off the Romans, and he didn't set up the kingdom. He just didn't fit our model, and so we considered him as nothing. And the language there, they considered him as non-existent, and that's exactly what happened, because they completely rejected him, and the Romans took him as a criminal and crucified him. And then you have this stunning reality in that chapter. It's like time stops. And you hear this in the past tense. He was bruised for our iniquities. He was chastised for our peace. Whoa, what happened? Zacharias says, the day will come when they look on him whom they've pierced and mourn for him as an only son. Wow, that's what they will say. Well, that's what the Jewish people will say when they look on the one they pierced and mourn for him as an only son. They'll say, we thought he was stricken by God. We thought we were doing the work of God in taking his life because he was a blasphemer. Now we see he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. And then, says Zechariah, a fountain of blessing is open to Israel and a fountain of salvation. And then you have that followed by the kingdom and all the fulfillment of the old covenant. And all of it comes when Israel looks at the Messiah and sees him for who he is. The interesting thing about Isaiah's prophecy of that is he doesn't say it's going to happen. He doesn't use future verbs. He uses past verbs because he's looking past Christ to when the Jews look back on the past. Now we see it. Now we see it. And the New Testament, Paul says in Romans 11, all Israel will be saved. That is the purpose and plan of God. There is a Christian kind of popular doctrine that I reject with all my heart, and that is that the church has replaced Israel in the promises of God. It's called supersessionism. I don't believe in that. I think that, honestly, hate to say this, but I honestly think it is a latent form of anti-Semitism to say that. You can't tell me that God made promises in the Old Testament to his people Israel concerning his future kingdom and salvation, and that he would give them a new heart and a new spirit, and he would write his laws in their heart, and they would be saved, and he would be their king, and they would be his people, and all those kingdom prophecies. You can't possibly tell me that God didn't mean what he said. New Testament says, in the future, the Messiah will return and establish his kingdom. The kingdom he promised, really starting in Genesis 12 with Abraham, the kingdom he reiterated to David, when the Messiah came, the greater son of David would establish his kingdom forever. The kingdom he promised to the prophets, the kingdom he promised with salvation to Jeremiah in Jeremiah 31, that he would put in Israel a new heart and a new spirit, and they would walk after his laws. And the New Testament says the Messiah came the first time to be the sacrifice for the sins of his people. The second time he comes to establish that kingdom. The Lord will do it in the future when he returns to establish the kingdom on earth. And the New Testament teaches that that's a real, actual kingdom. Even Isaiah defines the lion lying down with the lamb and the desert blossoms like a rose. There's a lot of elements that they're physical as well as spiritual.
It's fascinating to me when I talk with people who are real biblical scholars from the Christian side, that all the, I won't say all, a lot of the areas where Christian scholars think that Christianity has departed dramatically from Judaism, I think are not really dramatic departures. They seem to be reflections of Judaism from a slightly different angle. Even so far as a lot of the stuff in the Sermon on the Mount about, love, when it says that you're supposed to love thy brother as thyself, and you're supposed to treat your brother as you would wish to be treated, and all of this. I mean, that's present in the Old Testament too.
No, I think what Jesus did in the Sermon on the Mount was elevate the teaching of the rabbis. Elevate it. He went above them. He said, well, you've been told you shouldn't commit adultery. I'm telling you, if you look at a woman to lust after her, you've committed adultery in your heart. He got to the heart of the law. They were content with the practical application of the law. He was not content with that. So I would say that Jesus was the purest Jew that ever lived because he understood the elevation of the law to the heart and the soul. It would be a monstrous responsibility for some committee to have invented Jesus. When you hear even the people in his time saying, never a man spoke like this man, that he is a person that doesn't seem to have been a product of human invention. And you could say, well, Jesus is a good teacher, but good teachers don't claim to be God. They don't say, I and God are one. They don't say, I created the universe. That's not a good teacher. That's somebody who's crazy, as a lunatic, or somebody who's trying to pull off a huge deception. So you cannot come to Jesus and just patronize him as a noble, good Jewish teacher, because he crossed a line. He crossed a severe line, and the Jews saw that. Either he's the Messiah or he is a blasphemer, and he needs to be put to death. And those are really the choices you have. So when you ask me to show the variation between Judaism and Christianity, morally, no, there's none. But the distinction between Christianity and Judaism is what we do with Jesus Christ. The writer of Hebrews says, if a sacrifice had been enough to atone for sin, they would have stopped making them. But they never stopped. Morning and evening, morning and evening, morning and evening, morning and evening. Basically a priest was a butcher. He had blood up to his waist. Right? I mean,
That's true.
He was a butcher. He had blood up to his waist. And the frustration of it, even on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, all the bloodletting, and year after year after year after year, this goes on, this goes on, this goes on. You have this most amazing thing. You come to the death of Jesus Christ, and at the death of Christ, the veil in the temple is rent from top to bottom. The Holy of Holies is thrown open. Wow, that's a statement from God, because it couldn't have been ripped by men from the top down. The way to God is open. There's no more barriers because a suitable sacrifice has been found. This is the Lamb of God. And amazingly, soon after that, the whole sacrificial system ends, because that's the final sacrifice. And God validates that sacrifice by raising him from the dead. The resurrection is a provable historical fact. So I think that's the issue. It's what do you do with Jesus? That's the issue of Christianity. And I would just say, I have such a love for Israel. I mean, all the people I love the most are Jewish, from Abraham, to the Apostle John, who wrote the last book in the Bible. I have the same passion that Paul had. He could almost wish himself accursed for Israel's sake, because they have a knowledge of God, but they don't know him, because he can only be known through Christ. And that's the Christian message. This